Okay, go ahead.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Old Cemetery Society Sunday afternoon tour. Today is Sunday, June the 6th, and my name is John Adams. And for the next hour or so, I'm going to be walking around Ross Bay Cemetery. This is a live Zoom. And we're going to be talking about people that were connected with annexationism. That is, annexation to the United States back in the late 1860s here in Victoria. Victoria was, in fact, a hotbed of annexationism for British Columbia. The other parts of the province, of course, Vancouver didn't exist yet, but New Westminster did, and places like Barkerville and other gold rush towns did exist. It wasn't quite so intense there for annexation. In fact, there were many strong Confederationists in those places. In Victoria, it was mixed. The majority of annexationists were here, but they were also partly outnumbered by people eventually who favored Confederation, but also a group of people who were kind of in the middle, who didn't want to join the United States, but at the same time, they didn't want to join Canada. So what was the option? Well, go it alone. As a British colony, of course, they somehow, in their misguided way, assumed that Britain would welcome us as a colony, a standalone colony, as we had been for some years at that point. Of course, what many of them didn't realize was Britain was fed up with its colonies. The Little England movement was keen to divest the British Empire of some of its more expensive colonies, and Vancouver Island and British Columbia that had united in 1866 were definitely a drain on the exchequer. And so they wanted to get rid of us. There's no doubt about it. So what we're going to talk about today are not the people who favored Confederation or the people who favored going it alone, except in one remote case. We're going to talk about the people who actually favored annexation and made no bones about it. And we get their names from two petitions that were sent, one in 1866, 67, and another one in 1870, or 1869, sent to President Ulysses S. Grant. And some critics have said, oh, there weren't many people who signed those petitions, and when you look at the names, they were all foreign-born, and so on. I'm not sure what that actually signifies, but nonetheless, historians traditionally have poo-pooed the idea of the annexation petitions and said it didn't really amount to very much, even at the time. However, always being a contrary person, I actually take a different interpretation. I think that although it wasn't a movement that eventually succeeded, it was a very strong movement, and that many of the people, whether they were from foreign countries or not, nonetheless, there were lots of them, and many of them were very prominent individuals. Of course, not all were prominent, and some of the names are almost impossible to track down, especially those that eventually left the colonies. But there are some, and I'm sure you'll recognize the names of a number of the people I'll be talking about, who were very upright and leading citizens. And I'd like to start with the first one, just over here, and I'm going to go in and out of, you're seeing my wonderful face and the grave that we're going to be talking about. So let me just take a moment to flip over to the other view. Here we are. Hang on. Where did that little icon go? Here we are. Okay. Some of you might recognize this. I'm going to show you where I was just sitting on this very nice bench right there, right next to the grave of Sir James and Lady Douglas. And just to have a look around, this is the main carriageway around the cemetery, coming off Fairfield Road. And if we turn the camera that way, down toward what was the main entrance. But we're going to stop first at this grave. This is the grave of Henry Heisterman and his family. And I'm starting here in part because he was the one who headed the list of people who signed the annexation petition, the first one, and I'm quite sure was very instrumental in making sure that other people signed the second one as well. He was born in Bremen, Germany, 1832. It wasn't Germany yet, of course. When he was 18, he entered a business house in Danzig, and from there he went to Liverpool 5 years later. But in 1862, he couldn't resist the gold excitement in British Columbia that had started with the big gold rush of 1858, and he arrived here with a party of gold seekers. But like many others, he didn't really succeed very well, at least in the gold mining business. but he settled down to commercial pursuits. And he started a partnership with a man named John Banks. He sold wholesale paints and glass. And about 1864, he began the financial, real estate, and insurance business that he so successfully conducted until his death. But nonetheless, he was a very shrewd businessman, and he got a reputation for being one of the best authorities on the city on the values of real estate. For a number of years, he was also a high-ranking Freemason in Victoria. He held the position of Grand Treasurer for a while. And Mr. Heisterman also married well. One of his daughters married a man by the name of David Kerr, who was one of the founders of the Brackman and Kerr milling business that was extremely well known. In fact, became the largest milling company in Western Canada at one time. So we're not dealing with lightweights in all cases. We're dealing with people like Mr. Heisterman, who is in a very prominent position here in the cemetery, right next to Sir James Douglas and right next to the main carriageway going around the cemetery. We've got lots of people to include on our tour today, and I'm going to include only short excerpts about some of them, so I'll keep on walking. And as we enter this area, we're in the Presbyterian section. And this is the area we'll be in for the first while. And our next grave is just in here. Just a grassy plot, not too much to see. And for those of you that are saying, well, how do I know that Mr. Kammerer, Christian William Kammerer to be exact, is here? Well, it's because the burial records that are quite complete tell us that he's here. He was born in Hamburg in 1824, and he arrived in Victoria in the early 1860s, along with many others, for the big gold rush era. He got a job working for Mr. Hibben in his stationery company, and we'll talk about Hibbins in a short while. It seems that Hibbins was a nest of annexationists from the very beginning. And later, Mr. Kammerer became a partner in the firm. He stayed after British Columbia became part of Canada in 1871, and eventually, along with Mr. Hibben, in 1880, took out his naturalization papers. So he became a British subject in 1880. But he had very different ideas, did Mr. Kammerer, back in the late 1860s. Now, just a rather difficult stone, laid flat on the ground, clearly vandalized many years ago, broken in two, now dirty. Perhaps this is one that the Old Cemetery Society could take on as a project. This is the grave of Julius Youngerman. He was born in 1820 in Hesse Kassel, Germany. Arrived in Victoria, actually as a 41-year-old in 1861, and he became a jeweler. I'm not sure how much need there was for jewelers at that time, but nonetheless, he became a jeweler, and he was also a Freemason. And so it's not surprising that he rented premises on the ground floor of the Freemasons' Hall, as it was then, not the present one on Douglas Street, near Fiskard Street, but a building on Government Street. And he built his house nearby, or he occupied a house nearby, where the Irish Times pub is now, at the corner of Bastion Square and Government Street. One of his daughters, Augusta, married well into a family of brewers, German brewers. Mr. Erb, Augusta married him. And in 1877, Youngerman was involved in a partnership with a man by the name of Rudolph. We'll talk about Mr. Rudolph a little bit later, because he also signed one of the annexation petitions. We do know a little bit more about Mr. Youngerman because when he died in 1897, his funeral was conducted by one of the city's foremost undertakers, Thomas Story. This was in 1879. And the hearse was made here in Victoria, and it carried the body of Mr. Youngerman here to Ross Bay and buried here. It was a fabulous hearse with glass sides, pulled by black horses, covered with tassels and crepe. And the funeral was quite a funeral to behold at that time, but the colonist newspaper picked up the story because of the fabulous hearse. It was used many, many times after that. So we don't have far to go right now. And those of you that follow our tours might think that this looks familiar. In fact, it is. It was one that Yvonne covered on one of her recent tours about the Civil War. This is the grave of the US consul in Victoria back in the 1860s and 70s. His name is Allen Francis. And if I get a little bit closer, you can see it says in memory of Allen Francis, USC, United States Consul, born in Weatherfield, Connecticut. He died in 1887, age 72. So last week, Yvonne was telling us about how Mr. Francis was able to nip in the bud some of the attempts to nab ships here in Victoria that were going to be used for the Confederate cause. Of course, we had lots of Confederate supporters here in Victoria during the Civil War. But after the Civil War, he stayed around. And he was very involved in encouraging the annexationists. Some of them didn't need encouraging at all, but some of them did. And from within here in Victoria, he encouraged people like Mr. Heisterman and others to get on with it and to sign the petitions. He was instrumental in sending those petitions to President Grant, and in other ways aiding and abetting the annexationists here. But at the same time, Mr. Francis was also writing reports to William Seward. He was one of the cabinet ministers in the US government. He was the one in 1867 who had masterminded the acquisition of Alaska for $7 million. And he was sending his official reports to Mr. Seward, telling him how many annexationists were here in Victoria. And in the process, quite likely exaggerating significantly the number of annexationists who were here. So this just encouraged William Seward and many others who thought that British Columbia, or for that matter, other parts of Canada, should become one of the states of the United States. Anyway, it's quite likely that from within, encouraging the annexationists, and from without, encouraging people like Seward to pursue this, Mr. Francis really was a main instrument in the annexationist movement here in Victoria. Now, as we leave his grave, we're going to go just a short distance over here. I've turned myself around, so we're going to go right here to the grave. It simply says Hibben. You might recognize that name, Thomas Napier Hibben. Thomas Napier Hibben was born in 1828 in Charleston, South Carolina, came to California in the 1849 gold rush, as so many did. And he had a stationery business down in San Francisco. And in 1858, he decided, like so many others, to come up here. So he sold his business down there. And for those of you that are historians, you'll recognize the name H. Bancroft. He became one of the foremost historians in the United States at that era. He bought the business in 1858 down in San Francisco. So Hibben arrived here, and before long, he had established T.N. Hibben and Company, stationers and booksellers. And a number of his employees, including Hibben himself, had their names on the annexation petition. So they're all close together right here. Some of them well-known, like Allen Francis. Some of them, like Hibben, quite well-known, even when I was a kid. Hibben's was one of the foremost stationers here in Victoria, down on Government Street. I'm going to walk now just a short distance, and we're going to be stopping at a grave in a moment. But on the way, I just couldn't resist, and I don't know whether Valley Ann is watching today. Hopefully she is, because since we were passing right by her great-grandmother's grave, we'll stop here. This one is for you, Valley Ann. This is the grave of Annie Price, who married John Harper. They were sweethearts back in New Brunswick, and they came out here. Unfortunately, Annie died shortly after childbirth on May the 31st, 1876. She died in Seebeck, Washington Territory. Her body was brought back here. Was she an annexationist? Was John Harper? We don't think so. They were from New Brunswick. It's quite likely that they were loyal, but the very fact that she died at Seebeck, Washington Territory, it's a very small place. It was a lumbering town at the time. It shows that there was a close connection between Victoria and other places just across the line up and down the coast and in Puget Sound. The steamers went back and forth on a regular basis. Just to finish the story about Annie, even though she died 4 days after giving birth to Howard, Howard survived. And Father John sent him back to New Brunswick, where he was raised. And Annie is descended from that branch of the family. So I couldn't miss that grave walking by, so I thought I would point it out. But the next grave that I'd like to include is this one right here. A very large red granite column mounted by an urn. And just to get our bearings, let me show you where we're standing. We haven't gone very far from home base. Yes, that's the grave of Sir James and Lady Douglas. We started just on the other side of that with Mr. Heisterman's grave. So we've gone in a bit of a semicircle and we've arrived back here, still in the Presbyterian section of the cemetery. John Dixon, that's who's buried here, and his family. He was born in 1827 in Dungannon County, County Tyrone, Ireland. By 1862, he had been living in the States for a number of years. He claimed at the time, and we have no reason to doubt him, that he was a US citizen by 1862. However, in 1858, he came to Victoria. He got into the business of selling stoves and hardware. He was one of the founding members of Victoria's Fire Brigade, and in fact served in almost every capacity in the volunteer fire brigades through the 1860s and 1870s. He was foreman, he was treasurer, he was the chief engineer, and he was a delegate and president of the Board of Delegates. So a very high-ranking individual here in town. He also worked on steamboats, and at one point was purser and part owner of the riverboat Glenora on the Stikine River. And it was up in that area that he died, where he died in 1875. He died in Wrangell, Alaska. So here we have somebody from Ireland, and he was also one of the signatories to the annexation petition. Now we're going to stay in the Presbyterian section, and we're going to continue over here to a couple of graves that aren't marked all that well. But we don't have too far to go. I'm just going to point this one out on the way. This is the grave of the Nesbitt family, the family of the cracker manufacturer, Samuel Nesbitt. And I noticed actually something I'd never noticed before, that the Dixon grave that we just looked at there has a member of the family whose middle name was Nesbitt. Do you suppose there's some business or other link to the Nesbitt family? I suspect there must be, because it's not a very common name. So we're going to work our way over here. And just in passing, we'll talk about a few other people who are buried in the Presbyterian section. Not surprisingly, at least one of them is a Scot, Thomas Curry. And Thomas Curry has a very small monument set in the ground, and it's covered in grass. When I was here the other day doing a dry run, so I won't even attempt to look for it right now, but it's in this immediate area right here. We don't know much about him, except that he was born in Mayball, Ayrshire, which is near Glasgow, in 1833, and that he came here, as many did, and was in the gold mining business. But he was primarily involved in gold mining up in Omanika and Cassiar, far to the north. Now, Henry Rudolph. Henry Rudolph is also buried in an unmarked grave, just here, not very far from from Thomas Curry. Henry Rudolph was in partnership at one time with Julius Youngerman. We talked about Youngerman's jewelry shop earlier. Rudolph was born in Germany, and he listed his occupation from the earliest days here in Victoria as watchmaker and jeweler. So we have a mixed bag of people who signed the annexation petitions from different places. We've had people from Ireland, from Scotland, from Germany, and although Francis did not sign it, He was from the United States. And as we head over this way, we're going to find the grave of a very prominent family, the Lowenberg family. You might be able to see the very large mausoleum in the distance. And just as we're approaching that place, there's a small pipe fence around the grave of Leopold Lowenberg and his family. And they just happen to have very distinctive markers on their grave. These are ledger stones, 3 of them side by side. And just here on one of the main roads coming into the cemetery, the large mausoleum of the Mackenzie family from Craigflower Farm, just over there. Standard Avenue just beyond that gate we're looking at up that way. But let's talk for a little bit longer about Leopold Lowenberg. He was born in 1818. His name is on this ledger, and it's in lead letters. It's white marble. This one would clean up very nicely, but we'd have to be very careful of not tampering with the lead letters that would pop out quite easily. He was born in Potsdam, in Prussia. He arrived here and immediately became involved in land purchases and had a dispute, in fact, with the Hudson's Bay Company over some of the land that he purchased from them, a strip of property that was on the site of what the Parliament buildings are on now. He became a real estate agent very, very early. And he was also involved, along with some of the others we've talked about, in the early fire brigades, the volunteer fire brigades, as early as 1858. He was also on the founding committee and was one of the earliest trustees of the Union Club, along with some other very prestigious people, such as the Chief Justice, Sir Matthew Bailey Begbie, and other members of the Supreme Court bench, the Honorable John Hamilton Gray, and Justice Tyrwhitt Drake, and many, many others. So when some historians said these were lightweights, foreign-born, just troublemakers, no, these were people that had very prominent positions in the community and were very esteemed by many others. In 1873, he was also one of the directors of the Victoria and Esquimalt Railway, one of the precursors of what later became the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway. When Lowenberg died in 1884, it's always interesting to see who the pallbearers were, and the newspaper always mentioned who the pallbearers were, and you got to know what sort of social circles they were moving in. Well, as I'm pointing my camera just over here, we're looking at the grave of Sir Matthew Bailey Begbie, the Chief Justice, and they would have known each other very well, at least through the Union Club. Begbie served as one of Leopold Lowenberg's pallbearers. Now, we're not going over by Begbie's grave quite yet. We're going to go over here. So we're getting very close to the road. And there's a grave just in here. If any of you attended the tour conducted by Mark Anderson last year on Freemasons, you might remember that he stopped at this grave. This is the grave of John Frederick Becker. He was born in Meldorf, Holstein, in 1840, what is now Germany. He married, and in 1864, he and his wife came to Victoria. He was a barber, and Mr. Becker was in partnership with a few others, all Germans, Louis Vigalius and Thomas Geiger. We'll stop at their graves a little bit later, because all 3 signed the annexation petition, and they started a business called the San Francisco Baths. They cut hair, and in days when many people didn't have hot running water in their homes, or a bathtub for that matter, the San Francisco Baths provided all the grooming needs that many men who were passing through Victoria might need. In 1872, it seems that Mr. Vigalius headed off on his own to found the St. Nicholas Baths, but Becker and Geiger stayed on their own, and they continued operating the San Francisco Baths for a number of years. John Becker was a prominent Freemason. He also made his name, perhaps to historians, because of a house that he once occupied and in fact owned in the early 1870s. It's a house today that stands on Rudlin Street. In fact, the address is 1243 Rudlin Street. But when Becker and his family lived there, it was on Johnson Street at the corner of Vancouver. It was a house that was built by John Dandridge. And John Dandridge was one of the black pioneers who came here. And the house was later moved and has now been restored and has received quite a bit of attention in recent years. Who were the pallbearers at Becker's grave? Well, Henry Heistemann was one of his pallbearers. And you can imagine that within the German community, and many of these people were members of the Germania Singverein, the discussion of politics took a very, very prominent role at many of their meetings. Now we're going to walk a little bit more over this way, parallel to Fairfield Road. And we're still staying in the Presbyterian section. We tend to think of Presbyterians as being Scottish, but many of them were. And some of them did sign the petitions, but a lot of the other people, the Germans especially, were probably Lutherans and people that felt very comfortable with the Presbyterian services. There was later a German Lutheran church here in Victoria, but I don't believe there was in the 1860s and 1870s. As we head over this way, we're going to approach the grave of Emily Carr. And I'm sure anyone who knows Ross Bay Cemetery or has been on our tours before is very quick to point out that Emily Carr's grave is the most frequently visited grave in the cemetery. And we often include her grave on our tours. And if we don't, we'll get asked where it is. And so it's actually easiest if we just go there directly. We're not going to be talking about Emily Carr today. I don't think her family were involved in the annexationist movement at all. Emily wasn't even born at the time that the petitions were sent. But there's a grave very close, two graves, in fact, very close to the Carr family plot. I'll point out the Carr family plot as we go, and that will get your bearings. There's a big tree right here, a huge pine tree. And just beyond it, this big curbing, I'll point out the name Carr. Here we are. The Carr family are buried here. Richard and Emily Carr, Sr., and 4 of their 5 daughters and their son, Richard, as well. Emily is buried just up in the upper left-hand corner of the grave. But let's now swing the camera just over here, and we'll come to the grave of Thomas Chadwick. So some of the historians said, oh, foreign born. Well, not Thomas Chadwick. He was born in England. He was born in Northamptonshire, England to be exact. And he was born in 1827. We don't know too much about him, although his grave is quite a significant one. But we know that when he came to Victoria, he was a saloon keeper and quite likely had been in that business in other places where he'd lived. He was the proprietor of a number of saloons, drinking establishments. One of them was the International. In 1868, he opened a place that is still there, the Garrick's Head, on Government Street near the top of Bastion Square. Although there was a large gap in its operation, but he started it on New Year's Eve, 1867 to be exact. And in 1871, he was operating another saloon at the corner of Douglas and Johnson Streets, a place that he called the Blue Post. So Thomas Chadwick, just to show that not all of the annexationists were aliens. Of course, the people that were opposed to annexationism accused them of everything under the sun. They were being seditious. They were traitors. But until the 1930s and 40s, nobody knew exactly who had signed those petitions. And so in some cases, they were just guessing whose names were on the petitions. I think the people who signed them understood that if they made too much noise, they might be considered pariahs here in Victoria. Well, we haven't gone very far. I'm looking at two more ledgers. These ones are made of red granite. Beautiful red granite. And the name here on the footstone, let's see if we can see it. Not so easy to see in this light. It's Joseph Lovett. And his name appears on this side of this ledger. Who was Joseph Lovett? Well, he was an American. He was born on Long Island, New York, 1822. He was a pilot on ships in the Gulf of Mexico before coming here. He married a woman from Montgomery, Alabama. Kate Fairfax was her name. They went to San Francisco together in the 1850s. And according to his obituary in the colonist newspaper, he was captain of a steamboat in San Francisco Harbor while he lived there. But in his spare time, he also became a great authority. That was the term used, a great authority on horse racing. The Lovetts came up to Victoria in 1860, and they must have done very well because these graves were not cheap to produce. In 1884, they built a two-story brick building at the northwest corner of Blanchard and Broughton Streets, a building that is still there. And he also became a member of the BC Pioneer Society. It was an early day historical society, but restricted to those who had been in Victoria during the very early days of settlement, not the Indigenous people. In fact, it's unusual to think that a group called the Pioneer Society wouldn't include them. It included others who had come from other places, and Mr. Lovett was certainly one of the members of the Pioneer Society. And as we pass this very large plot, we're passing the plot of Dr. Jim Helmkin and his first wife, Daisy, who died young, and his second wife, and also the grave of two of the grandchildren, or one of the grandchildren of old Dr. John Helmkin. Let me just back up a little bit. It's a bit confusing because there were so many of them. Dr. John Sebastian Helmkin, born in London, England, but of German parentage, came here in 1850. And he remained here. His house that he built in 1852 is still standing on its original site beside the Royal BC Museum. He was sometimes accused of being an annexationist, and he certainly was not in favor of Confederation. And some of the things he said sounded as though he was an annexationist. But in the end, he claimed that he really wanted the independent route. He thought that we should become an independent colony. In the end, he also fell for Confederation and was one of the delegates sent to Ottawa in 1870 to see just what the Canadian government might provide to British Columbia if we didn't go it alone or didn't become part of the United States. So I'm stopping here only because the name Helmkin, certainly he was Dr. John Sebastian Helmkin Sr., was a very prominent person. And although he wasn't truly an annexationist like some of the others, and he certainly did not sign the petition, he was one of the people whose role might have seemed to be encouraging the ones that did not want to become part of Canada. He certainly was very strongly opposed to being part of Canada. And why was that? Why would anyone want to oppose being part of Canada? Today, it just seems like a foregone conclusion. And when we look at American history, of course, manifest destiny and the westward march of the United States across the continent seemed almost inevitable. It wasn't quite that way in Canada. And the arguments, and these are arguments that Helmkin himself, Dr. John Sebastian Helmkin, made, why would we join Canada? It's a ludicrous suggestion. When Canada was formed in 1867, it was just 4 colonies, what is now Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, 3,000 miles away. And the intervening territory, the provinces of what are now Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, then Rupert's Land, part of the Hudson's Bay Company territory, wasn't even part of Canada. And in 1867, just months before Canada was started, on July the 1st, 1867, the United States purchased Alaska. So here we were on the West Coast, hemmed in by the United States, north and south, and by territory that wasn't even Canadian territory, east of the Rocky Mountains. 3,000 miles away. with no way to get there except through the United States. It seemed ludicrous when, on a clear day, you can see the United States 25 kilometers away across the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And of course, the United States was prosperous. They provided votes, at least for certain people, whereas the idea of responsible government here was something that many people wanted, but were not able to achieve. And so joining the United States for many seemed like a good way to get responsible government and to benefit ourselves economically as well. Now, I am looking for a grave here. It is just, Yvonne will recognize these graves, the Robertson graves, Civil War stories were told on their graves last week. But nonetheless, I'm going to look just in here, and it's almost impossible to see, but the grave of Thomas Burns. Thomas John Burns is just in here. It's not very well marked at all. Thomas John Burns was born in Ireland, in Dublin, in 1832, went to San Francisco, as many people did, came up to Victoria in 1858. This is a familiar story we've told about people that came up here before from San Francisco in 1858. He got a job working for the Customs House in the colony of Vancouver Island. But by 1869, Mr. Burns and his family got into the hotel business, purchasing the American Hotel on Lower Yate Street, just next to where the Yate Street Parkade is today, backing onto Bastion Square. He became a member of the fire department. And in the 1880s, his family built the Burns House. The old American Hotel is gone, but Burns House still stands as one of the very prominent buildings on Bastion Square. In 1907, Mr. Burns, as a very old man, rejoined the Customs Service. And he was working for the Customs Service when he died. So we're now here in Section M, as it's officially known, a section reserved for general purposes. But interesting that Mr. Burns and a number of the other people that we've talked about also have Irish connections. And of course, there was no love lost in Ireland between the Irish and the English, at least the ones who had not become Anglo-Irish, the ones who supported the Anglican Church and the English ruling of Ireland. There were lots of people who wanted Ireland to be independent. And so by joining the United States, perhaps it was an easy way to help achieve that. We'll catch up a little bit later with some of the other people who had different ideas about what role Ireland should play in the history of Canada. So I'm stopping here. This is a new grave for Sylvia Phyllis Lyle, 2008. She wasn't an annexationist as far as I know. I know nothing about her. But I'm using that just as a landmark to find the grave here of Alexander Hendry. This is all that's left. This is the footstone of what was probably a fairly large plot with a curbing around it, possibly even a headstone. We know he's here and other members of his family, but in fact, we have no idea of knowing whether there was a headstone at any time, because so many of them were removed through the 1950s and 1960s, before the Old Cemetery Society stopped the city of Victoria from doing that. Hendry was born in Scotland. He was a member of the Independent Order of Odd Fellows. He was a member of the Fire Brigade. We know that he lived on View Street, and we know that he died in Los Angeles in 1889, where he'd gone for his health a few months before. And apart from those brief details and the fact that he was one of the signatories on the annexation petitions, we don't know very much about Alexander Hendry at all. But I'd just like to go a short distance over here. By the way, we have now entered the Methodist section of the cemetery. The original cemetery was devoted to the main Christian groups in the city, Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian, and Methodist. So we've been in the Presbyterian section. We're now in the Methodist section. And I'm sure there were other Methodists who were members of the Annexationist movement, but I just haven't been able to find them here. It's quite likely that many of them drifted off to other places. So we've only got two to include on today's tour in the Methodist section, but we're right at the grave of one of them right here, Peter Oosterhout. Now, just to get your bearings, huge yew trees. And for those of you that take our tours and know the lay of the land, right over here, the grave of Peter Leach, the grave of Margaret Jenkins, and just peeking around the corner where those yew trees are, the grave of John Todd. But we're not talking about those people on today's tour. We'll get back to Peter Oosterhout. So who was he? Well, he's a person we don't know a huge amount about. We can see right away from his tombstone that was laid flat in the ground after being vandalized, it's cracked in two, that he was a Freemason. We see the square and compass and the capital G at the top. He was, in fact, a Freemason. He was born in 1817 in the States. We don't know exactly where he was born. I believe New York, but the grave doesn't tell us too much more. He did run a household goods store on Johnson Street and Store Street, very close to where Market Square is today. And I'm just going to read a very small excerpt. In fact, I might even have a chance to show you an ad that appeared in the Colonist. Just received from San Francisco in England, hardware and crockery. And it goes on to list a whole pile of things, a full line of woodenware, furniture, etc. Peter Oosterhout, corner of Johnson and Store Streets. So obviously a very successful business person here in Victoria, at least until his death in 1880, hang on, I'm just going to look up my note on that one, and his death in 1883. So we don't have too far to go, but we're going to head down this way. Continuing through the rest of the Methodist section, we're heading toward the water. And we're heading over to section F. Section F originally was allocated as a potter's field. Generally, most cemeteries would have a potter's field. It was a place where people without any means to buy their own grave, stillborn infants, suicides, people washed up on the beach, and basically people that were unknown might be buried in the potter's field at civic expense generally. But it was quite clear that others were buried down there as well. One of the people that we'll be talking about, and just to get our bearings, here's the wooden headboard put in by the Old Cemetery Society and the BC Black History Awareness Society, the grave of Nancy Davis Lester. And she's buried here. Her husband, Peter, went back to the States. They were part of the Black contingent who came up here in 1858 and 1859. But I don't know if they were annexationists. I don't believe they were. But as we go down this way, we're crossing the roadway. We're going to enter section F. And we're looking for the grave of Daniel W. Chancy. So Daniel Chancy, as far as I can tell, does not have a marker. And it's not unusual in this section. As we pan the camera this way, you can see there's lots of grass. And there aren't very many markers in evidence. Perhaps there were at one time stones, wooden head tablets that have since rotted away. There are none of the original wooden boards left. But it's just somewhere in here that Daniel Chancy is buried. He was born in 1830 in Brooklyn, New York. Came out for the gold rush after 1849 in California, and then arrived in Victoria in 1858. He was a carpenter. And it seems that he didn't get wealthy by panning for gold. He became wealthy by building buildings for other people. His obituary tells us that he was a member of the well-known Chancy family, who were riverboat captains on the Hudson River. And in fact, one of the very well-known steamboats that plied the Hudson River was known as the Chancy. As we head over this way, I can see it clearly from here. There's looks like a black stump just over here. This is the grave of Marshal Wilder Waite. And Marshal Wilder Waite is a very imposing stone. It's quite possible, in fact, it's almost certain that there would have been a large cross or something else on top. You can see there's a sort of an oval that marks where there is the base of something, but it certainly isn't there now. It's white marble, although you'd never know it. It's quite grimy. And this is a very handsome monument. Marshal Wilder Waite was born in Sardner, Maine in 1834. He arrived here and was one of the employees of Thomas Napier Hibbins, stationers and booksellers. He was working there by the early 1860s. And as I mentioned earlier, Hibbins seemed to be one of the nests of annexationism here in Victoria. In the mid-1870s, Waite started his own stationery store, but branched out into music as well, sheet music. And in fact, he was a very well-known firm. If you were a music student, if you were a piano teacher, you certainly would have known Waite's music store. He was also a Freemason. He was a member of the Provincial Grand Lodge of the BC Freemasons. In 1892, during a very brief but very tragic smallpox epidemic, Marshal Wilder Waite succumbed. After his death, his son-in-law, whose name was Herbert Kent, was also a Freemason, carried on the business that Marshal Waite had started in downtown Victoria. And Kent's music was very, very well known until recent years. Now, we're staying in the section F, which expanded its role from being the Potter's Field to being an area allocated to the Reformed Episcopal Church when it was established in Victoria in the mid-1870s. We'll work our way over here to one of the graves that I'd like to talk about next within the Reformed Episcopal section. And as we go, Billy Barker, famous from Cambridgeshire, came to BC during the Gold Rush era, worked in many areas, but he's best known because in 1862, he struck it rich big time in Barkerville. It wasn't called Barkerville then, of course, but it soon became known as Barkerville in the town that quickly sprang up around his very, very lucrative claim. However, over his lifetime, he came and went from his money fairly easily, it seems, and when he died in the 1890s, he was penniless and was being looked after at the expense of the city in what was then called the Old Men's Home. It was just on the edge of what is now Ross Bay Cemetery. So we're going to work our way over here. As I said, the Potter's Field eventually, at least partially, was allocated to the Reformed Episcopal Church, a breakaway evangelical Anglican group who still exist in the city, in the Church of Our Lord. And the man who really started the breakaway church here in Victoria was buried right here. His name was the Reverend, later the Bishop, Edward Cridge. I can't imagine that he was in favor of annexationism, so I'm just passing that along as we pass by. And some of the other fairly well-known families, the Parker and Ball families here beside this beautiful fence. Mr. Ball Sr. was a blacksmith, and it's said that he fashioned the beautiful, very intricate wrought iron fence all around the grave. Of course, these things don't last forever, and I guess it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago, the Old Cemetery Society took on the restoration of this. I'll just show you some of the details. Very, very beautifully done by volunteers from a blacksmith's group out at the Luxton Fairgrounds. Very intricate work. There was almost nothing left of the original that could be salvaged. And so we're very fortunate that they did this work so that we have a chance to see the type of work that was done by one of Victoria's very well-known blacksmiths in the early days. And as we pass here, we're looking at the grave of some of the Ross family. Isabella Ross, their mother, was the first woman in BC to own land in her own name, and her grave is not far away. We're not going quite there on today's tour, but we've included it many times. But we're now getting to the grave of Alfred J. Langley and his wife. And let me just show you this. I came on a sunnier day and peered hard at these graves, and it didn't mention the person that I'd like to talk about, but he is buried here as well. He was, in fact, the half-brother of A.J. Langley, whose monument I'm showing you right now. The person who is buried here, the half-brother, was George Robinson Farden. He was born in 1806 in Lichfield, Staffordshire, in the English Midlands. 1840s, he went to New York and then drifted off to California after 1849. And while he was there, he introduced daguerreotypes to that city. Daguerreotypes are an early form of photography. Came up to Victoria in 1858 and very quickly established a photographic studio here as well. The biography of George Robinson Farden tells us that he was the first American to apply both the outdoor capacity of wet collodion and its effectively infinite reproducibility. Farden is perhaps best acclaimed for his San Francisco album entitled Photographs of the Most Beautiful Views and Public Buildings of San Francisco, which he published privately in 1856. And that book made Farden the first person in the United States, and possibly in the whole world, to publish a collection of photographs of a metropolitan area. And he is considered to be of enormous historical importance. Anyway, he remained here until his death in 1886, and was buried here in the very large plot of his half-brother's family. The Langleys, by the way, operated a drugstore on Lower Yates Street. Now, we're going to move away from the Reformed Episcopal Section F. We're going to cross the roadway here. And it's easy to get turned around, especially when you're just watching. But if I put the camera down that way, we're looking out over the ocean, past the trees. And as we swing the camera this way, in the distance, we would see the grave of Isabella Ross. The white monument behind a fence is the Grimm family. They were carriage makers. But generally, everything that I'm showing you right here is Section C, the original section devoted to the Roman Catholics here in Victoria. And we're going to be visiting several of the graves. And the first one to include is just up here. It's this very, very large one. And those of you that have taken Michael Halloran's Murder Most Foul tour will certainly be familiar with this one. This is the grave. You'll say, oh, that's David Fee's grave. He was the young man in his early 20s who was gunned down by a Fenian assassin on the steps of St. Andrew's Cathedral on Christmas Eve, 1890. A sensational story if ever there was one. But we're not talking about David Fee Jr., the one who was gunned down by the Fenian assassin. By the way, it was a case of mistaken identity. We're going to look at the name on this side of the monument. D.F. Fee, David F. Fee. This was his father, born in Mercer County, Pennsylvania in 1827. Came to Victoria via San Francisco in 1861, and he came as the engineer on the steamer Enterprise. It was one of the well-known steamers that plied the coast between San Francisco and Puget Sound in Victoria. Well, it seems that Mr. Fee Sr. Remained the Enterprise engineer for intervals right up until 1883. And at various other times, he was also the engineer or the person who looked after the boilers and the steam apparatus on Beaver, Otter, Yosemite, and another steamboat called Wilson G. Hunt. But at the same time, his family ran a grocery store on Quadra Street at North Park Street. He branched out into that business at some point, but obviously for him, the work on the engines of the steamers was his primary occupation. It's totally ironic that his son, quite by chance, was gunned down by a Fenian assassin on the steps of the cathedral. Because, of course, there were many Fenians who were interested in Canada. From Canadian history, we know more about the Fenian Raids across the border near Buffalo and Fort Erie into southern Ontario. Who were the Fenians? Well, they were early adherents of independence for Ireland. And since it was quite clear that England was not going to give them independence, they were going to wrest it from England. And their tactics involved what we might call terrorist acts around the British Empire. The idea being that if they did enough to annoy the English, they would give up Ireland. Well, it didn't work. They got independence eventually, but in other ways. But in 1890, although the main Fenian movement had died down, there were still people that had similar ideas. And one of them had a great disliking for a man named Tom Daisy. They were working on the construction of St. Andrew's Roman Catholic Cathedral. And by the way, as I swing the camera this way, Tom Daisy is buried just over there, just past some of those trees. Tom Daisy just happened to be the fire chief and had annoyed a man by the name of Lawrence Whalen, who was a Fenian working on the construction. And it seems that Lawrence Whalen had it in for Tom Daisy and waited on Christmas Eve in the shadows of the church. A new one was being built, and he knew that Tom Daisy would be attending midnight mass, dressed in his white overcoat that would make him very, very easy to spot on a dark night in December. And the problem was Whalen had had a bit too much to drink and had passed out. He woke up and there was the man in white coming out of the church. He fired and, well, he got his man all right, but it was the wrong one. It wasn't Lawrence. It wasn't Thomas Daisy, the fire chief. It was young David Fee, who was dressed in a white clown suit, sneaking out of the cathedral to go back to a party. And indeed, the cause of Irish independence had not died down, but the Fenians in the 1860s believed that perhaps if they attacked Canada and encouraged Britain to give up British Columbia, then that would make it very, very easy. If they got British Columbia, then they could perhaps get the freedom for Ireland, almost holding British Columbia hostage. So a very complicated story, but nonetheless, a story that is a very sad one. Here at the grave of the Fee family that we just looked at. Now, I'm looking at the grave here of Louis Vigalius. Louis Vigalius was born in Bavaria. He was born in 1838 and came to Victoria in 1866. So just around the time that the Civil War was over and the Annexationists were beginning to work very, very hard in Victoria. And we saw the grave earlier of Joseph Becker, and Louis Vigalius was in partnership with Louis Becker and Thomas Geiger, whose grave we're going to see in a moment. Louis Vigalius branched out in 1872 to start the St. Nicholas Baths downtown. In 1886, he was elected a Victoria City alderman. His brother, Anton Vigalius, who was buried at the other end of the cemetery, arrived here in 1868. He was just in time to sign one of the annexation petitions, and he worked for his brother, Louis, in the barbershop at the St. Nicholas Baths and haircutting saloon. So Louis Vigalius, a very lovely monument, and just for context, it's right beside one of the main roadways right here. James Douglas's grave is just up there, but we're not going that way. We're going to stay in this area, and we're going to remain in the old Roman Catholic section of the cemetery, at least for a little bit longer. like some of the other areas, like Potter's Field, this area seems to have lots of empty spaces. It does, but they're not empty. They're not empty spaces. The monuments are gone. Grass fires burned up the wooden headboards. The wind and waves probably rotted many of them away. The stones were vandalized and hauled away. But it's just in here, we know from the burial records, that William Scully is buried. He was in a partnership with a number of other people here in Victoria. We don't know very much about Scully, but we know he's here, and he was one of the ones who signed the annexation petition. But just as we look over this way, I can tell you a little bit more about the family who are buried here. And just a couple of weeks ago, Diana Peterson gave us a wonderful tour about the Lusitania riot in Victoria in May of 1915, and she stopped at this grave. The store of Thomas Geiger in May 1915 was vandalized by the rioters. However, the man that I want to talk about was Thomas Geiger Sr., who died in 1911 at the age of 76. He did not see the Lusitania riot. He was born in Germany in 1836, and he was a barber and was in partnership here with Louis Vigelius and Joseph Becker. Later, this is in the early 1900s, he went into partnership with others in the Riverside Hotel in Lake Cowichan, a thriving business which attracted many day trippers from Victoria, and it was a good getaway to get to. His partner, by the way, was George Steli, and we'll visit George Steli's grave in just a moment. Thomas Geiger considered himself to be one of the earliest German pioneers in Victoria. In 1865, he married Amelie Lowen, and we'll see the grave of her father in a few minutes because Mr. Lowen Sr. signed the annexation petition. Many of them, including Thomas Geiger Sr., were members of the Germania Singverein, the German club here in Victoria. And just a note that I found as I was looking for information about the family, in 1910, Thomas and Amelie Geiger celebrated their 45th wedding anniversary. So now there's another grave not too far away, just down here. And we're all familiar with Finnerty Road that passes through the University of Victoria grounds and Finnerty Gardens. If you haven't had a chance to see the beautiful Finnerty Gardens with all the rhododendrons in the late spring, well, have a chance to go sometime. They're not to be missed. The stone right here gives us the name of John Finnerty, born in 1835, died in 1874. And then some of the others, children and grandchildren. Malcolm Pollock was one of them. And what I'm going to do is the recent generation of the Pollock family have placed this monument here. But let me just look over here slightly to the left because we have an older stone. This one right here. I have to be honest, I had passed over this many, many times and not really paid very much attention. And when I was doing the dry run for this tour, just the other day, it took me a while before I actually found it. And the burial records don't help a great deal because of the spelling of the name. I don't know if you can see it right here. Let me bring the camera down a little bit. Finnerty, F-E-N-E-R-T-Y. Well, it turns out that that was one of the traditional ways of spelling the name. However, the brother of John Finnerty, Michael Finnerty, couldn't read or write. And so eventually, the name Finnerty, F-I-N-N-E-R-T-Y, prevailed. And most of us are probably familiar with that name today. So who was John Patrick Finnerty? Well, He was definitely born in 1835, County Mayo, Ireland. And he and his brother Patrick started the Spring Park Farm in Gordon Head. They also had property near what is now the Royal Jubilee Hospital. The property was registered in John Finnerty's name. But when he died of tuberculosis in 1874, it left his wife and young children and his brother holding the bag. He died intestate. And it took a while before the courts were able to sort things out. But the property was eventually equitably divided between the family, the immediate family, and the brother. So the grave here is a rather intriguing one. And John Finnerty, who died in 1874 of tuberculosis, was definitely one of the ones who signed the annexation petition. Now, I don't know how many of you are believers in the occult, but let me just tell you something that took place when I was here on the dry run. As I mentioned, it took me a while before I actually found this monument. The burial records actually listed under Finnerty, so that was a bit confusing. But I finally found it, and then I noticed that the new monument was there, so I knew I was in the right place. And I had no sooner stepped away than I looked at my iPhone just to check the time, and an email message had just arrived, literally, as I was kneeling down at the John Finnerty grave. It was from David Pollock, John Finnerty's great-grandson, telling me that his great-grandfather had been one of the people who had signed the annexation petition. Now, I'm sure some of you know David Pollock. I've met him a number of times. We don't know each other well, and I don't hear from him, usually from one year to the next. It was absolutely uncanny. I froze, really, as I realized that as I had been kneeling down at his great-grandfather's grave, he was tapping his keys to send me the message to say that perhaps I could include it on the tour. I was going to anyway, but it was great to get that message. It was almost like a message from beyond. Now, I don't know if you can hear it. I'm sure you can. I don't know where the piper is. We're not going that far. Perhaps the piper is over by the Cross of Sacrifice, the war memorial at the far end of the cemetery, or perhaps somebody has been booted out of his house and has just been sent down to the cemetery to practice. But nonetheless, it's nice to hear the pipes in the distance. We're going to be now crossing up here, and we're going to be entering one of the several Anglican sections of the cemetery. We're on the homeward stretch right now. Just a few more graves to include. Bear with me because we're going beyond our usual hour. But I'd like to take you up here to the grave of George Steli. Now, George Steli doesn't seem to be the quintessential Anglican. We tend to think of people from England primarily who were Anglicans, but George Steli was from Switzerland. And George Steli arrived here in the early days after the gold rush of 1858. And he eventually took up land in what is now Central Saanich. Steli's Crossroad is the well-known street that crosses across the Saanich Peninsula from west to east. And Steli's secondary school is right there. So who was he? Well, he was Swiss. He was a farmer, and he was definitely one of the ones that signed the annexation petition. I'm just coming close to his grave. That's the big one, the taller one right there across the hedge. And yes, he was foreign born. He was from Switzerland, but it was quite clear that he was not a lightweight in the community. He was a very well-known, very prominent individual in Victoria. So that's one of the things I've tried to show today, that we've had many people who were prominent in the community, who were among those who signed the petitions. Steli, by the way, arrived in North America in New Orleans in 1852. He arrived in California in a roundabout way via Illinois and Iowa. He tried mining for a while at Emery's Bar and Hill's Bar on the Fraser River, but eventually, like so many others, gave that up and came down to Victoria, where he was a contractor for a while and a transfer agent before purchasing his land out in Central Saanich. Now, as we walk up this roadway, its Anglican sections both to the right and the left. And a couple of well-known names here. Finlayson over there to the right. I'm sure he wasn't an annexationist. And just over there, if I can see between the crosses, the one that is sandwiched between these two crosses, the upright granite one, that is the grave of Amor de Cosmos. He definitely was not an annexationist. He was one of the leaders of the Confederation group, in fact. But it might surprise you that it certainly surprised me when I discovered that probably one of the most prominent people, one of the wealthiest people, at least in terms of land, here at Ross Bay Cemetery, who was an annexationist, in fact, an ardent annexationist, Joseph Despard Pemberton. And he wrote a huge series of letters in the early 1870s, extolling the virtues of annexation. And not all who signed the petition, and he did not sign the petition, but it's very clear through his letters to the editor of The Colonist that he fully supported them. And he was Irish. He was born in Dublin. But in fact, he came out here, was the Surveyor General for the Hudson's Bay Company, the colony of Vancouver Island, later British Columbia. He owned huge tracts of land around Victoria, and his large house, Gonzales, is no longer standing, but it stood up on what is now Rockland Avenue, near Rockland Avenue, close to Government House. So the sorts of reasons that Pemberton and others gave for joining the United States rather than Canada, again, like Helmkin had said, too far away, the United States is so close. Pemberton had seen the economy of the United States. He'd worked in the United States. He also knew that they had responsible government, more or less. But he also understood that the British government had neglected British Columbia. That was one of the big arguments against remaining either in Canada, where we would simply be a kind of a second-class colony, or going it alone, which seemed to be ludicrous for some, Pemberton included. They were ignoring us now. Why would it change? And so his letters are very, very illuminating. But as we go this way, I'd like to stop at the grave of Joseph Lowen and his daughter, Amelie. That was one that we mentioned recently. And Joseph Lowen was born in 1832 in Prussia. By 1850, he found himself in New York City. I'll just come a little bit closer so you can see what it says on his monument. In 1856, he was in California, so he wasn't there at the very beginning of the gold rush there. But in 1858, he came up to BC. By 1869, he was a partner with Joseph Lovett in the Bank Exchange Saloon on Lower Yate Street, where the Parkade is now. He was also a member of the Germania Singverein and was the librarian of that group. And in 1871, became a partner in Herb and Lowen at the Victoria Brewery. And he continued in that business until his death in 1906. So there were lots and lots of connections among the people who signed the petition. And it turns out that stores like T.N. Hibben and Company, the Germania Singverein, the San Francisco Baths, it seems that everybody who was associated with those businesses would sign the petition. And you can imagine, especially in a place like a barber shop, the conversation that goes on even still. Barber shops are often places where politics are discussed a great deal. Now, another grave that we include from time to time is just up here. It's the grave of Captain William Mcneil. Captain William Mcneil, 1803, born in Boston, Massachusetts. And he came around the Horn with his trading ship, the Llama, and was in competition with the Hudson's Bay Company on the coast. In fact, the Hudson's Bay Company bought him out, but kept Mcneil as captain. Now, he was a U.S. citizen by birth, and he remained a U.S. citizen. He was the captain of Beaver, the first steamship here on the coast, from 1837 to 1843. And as captain of Beaver, he was sent up here in 1837 to scout the south coast of Vancouver Island for the possible site of a new Hudson's Bay Company fur trading post that eventually became Fort Victoria. They didn't figure it out right away, and he came back in 1843, bringing James Douglas and the crew of people who were going to establish the fort. In 1849, Mcneil was in Fort Rupert and was the person in charge of Fort Rupert, where the Hudson's Bay Company had coal mines. From 1856 to 1863, he was the chief factor at Fort Simpson, up around what is now Prince Rupert. And he retired to his farm in Oak Bay, but worked on trading ships for a number of years until his death of pneumonia in 1875. So he was a US citizen, and perhaps always held sympathies for the United States. And so he was definitely one of the ones who signed the petition. I have one more grave to include, and we're going to cross country here. You might see some deer. Oh, and a fawn. Not too far away. We'll pass right by them on our way to our final grave. Still in the Anglican section. And I should point out that one of the ploys that people like William Seward, Consul, Allen, Francis thought about was that during the Civil War, the English government that was supposed to be neutral really wasn't. And they had assisted the Confederacy by allowing boats to be built, including CSS, the Confederate steamship Chesapeake, and Alabama on the Mersey near Liverpool. Well, the CSS Alabama ended up doing a huge amount of damage to Union shipping in the Civil War. And after the Civil War, the North was angry. They wanted some compensation for the millions and millions of dollars in lost revenue, and in addition, the loss of the boats. The whole issue is known as the Alabama claims, and it was taken very seriously. It amounted to millions and millions of dollars. Well, Britain was holding out. And so Seward and others were saying, well, you know, it would be very, very easy. Yeah, it's a lot of money, but why don't you just give us British Columbia? And we'll forget it. It'll be even. And it seems that the British government was, to some extent, considering this, but in the end, they encouraged British Columbia to join Canada. They held out, and the Alabama claims were settled, but in a different way. But British Columbia was part of the negotiations for a while. Now, our final grave is this one, actually a series of graves. And I don't know if you can see the name on the first round monument. It's just the base. The rest of it is missing. There was a small statue on that at one time. This is the grave of the Swanson family. And let me just show you some of the names here. They're not easy to read, actually, because they're very old monuments. You can see this one has a beautiful winged head, the cherub's head. This monument actually predates Ross Bay Cemetery. This one stood at Pioneer Square, the old burying ground. It's the grave of Captain John Swanson. He was born in 1827. Captain Swanson was born in Rupert's Land, what is now Canada. It was administered at the time by the Hudson's Bay Company. He joined the Hudson's Bay Company as a lad, about 14 years old, and in 1843 arrived in BC as an apprentice on the schooner Cadborough. He was here in 1843 and helped clear the site of Fort Victoria In 1859, he was elected for Nanaimo to represent Nanaimo and the Vancouver Island Assembly. In 1860, he became a chief trader for the Hudson's Bay Company and eventually commanded a series of vessels, including La Bouchère and Otter, two well-known Hudson's Bay Company boats, and in 1866 became captain of Enterprise. That same year, he became a member of the BC Pilot Board. The next year, he was the commissioner for pilots in BC. He married a woman who was Tlingit. He was also a Freemason. And when he died in 1872, before this cemetery was formally established, he was buried at Pioneer Square with a full Masonic funeral. It was only later that his remains and his monument were moved here. So I thought I would finish with Captain Swanson because he was the only Canadian-born person I could find who signed the annexation petitions. There might have been others. There are many of the names that are almost impossible to research, but we have concluded our stories. And I'm just going to turn the camera back to me. And I'm glad the rain held off. It's actually not an unpleasant day at all right now. And I hope you had a chance to stay with me through this very long tour and the 31 people that I included on the tour, which is a little bit more than many of our tours, but as you saw, I didn't have a huge amount to say about some of the people, but I wanted to include the diversity of people that I was able to identify. And maybe this is research for the future. Maybe we will be able to find out more. And if we went to the Jewish cemetery, I could include even more people who lived in Victoria and died in Victoria who signed the petition. But we're not going to do that. We'll go to the Jewish cemetery for another tour later in the summer. By the way, the sequel to this tour I will be conducting on July the 18th, this coming summer, and it will be about Confederation because 2021 marks the 150th anniversary of British Columbia becoming part of Canada. So it's quite clear that as hard as they tried, the Annexationists lost out and the Confederationists won. But more about that when we do the next tour on July the 18th. So just wondering if any of you have any questions or comments.
Yeah, John, I do. It's John Azar. I just, before I make my comment, I want to mention the bagpipe might have been at the Cross of Sacrifice because today is the 77th anniversary of the D-Day landings.
That would explain it because it sounded as though it was coming from there.
Yeah. Lots of Freemasons and lots of Germans mentioned. Geiger, would I say Geiger was a shopkeeper?
That Geiger himself was a barber. It was his son Thomas Jr., who was the shopkeeper.
Okay, because I couldn't help thinking that transactions in his shop would have taken place at the Geiger counter.
Yes, indeed.
But now, how robust was the discussion in town and in the newspapers?
Well, the discussion was very robust, and it seems, depending on which historian you look at, that the annexationists were very strong or very weak. It seems as though it might have been somewhere in between, that maybe they were making a lot of noise, but in the end, they didn't have quite as much clout as people worried about at the time. People like Alan Francis really did say that the annexationists were working very, very hard here in Victoria and that the majority of people were annexationists. Yeah, it seems, based on the number of people that signed the petitions, that there certainly were lots who were annexationists, but it certainly wasn't a majority. Right. And it was mostly in Victoria, not in New Westminster.
Right. I know it's 40 years later, but is there any, was the annexation debate with all the Germans involved on the one side, could that have led to an underlying non-British supporting attitude 40 years later when the Lusitania riots broke out? Or is it too far away?
I think it's too far away. I'm not sure if there were any of the original annexationists who were here, and even their children probably wouldn't have been aware of it. It wasn't until the 1930s and 40s when some historians got a hold of the annexation petitions in Washington, D.C. in the U.S. archives that they really found out who was signing it. because it was unknown. It was some of them did not hide the fact, but many of them did not let it be known. So, and if you look at things that were taking place immediately prior to World War I, the Germania Singverein, for example, was a very popular group. Yeah. And they were buddy-buddy with people who were later, within a couple of years, on the other side. So I have a suspicion that, no, it didn't have an effect 40 years later.
Right. Who was the petition made to?
To the U.S. President, Ulysses S. Grant. And whether Grant looked at it seriously, we don't know for sure. But it seems that the petition was sort of lost in the U.S. archives for a number of years. And eventually, Willard Ireland, who was the BC archivist at various times from the 1930s right up until the 1960s, was the one who wrote about the annexation petitions. But they didn't actually have a copy of them until, I don't know what year they arrived here, but it was sometime in the late 1930s. And then a little bit more became apparent. And it was Willard Ireland who was actually the one who pointed out that most of the signatories, at least the ones they could find out about, were not British subjects. They were foreign-born, German, Jewish, Freemasons, and so on. You can read into that a little bit of conspiracy theory. But what I tried to do on my tour today was to show that, yeah, there were some of those people, but there were lots of others as well. I think it was a very diverse group that was involved. And the annexationists, even though their individual identities weren't always known, the newspaper editors who probably had more influence simply because of who they were, Amour de Cosmos with the Colonist and later the Standard, and John Robson with the newspapers in New Westminster, they called no punches. They said that the people that were annexationists were traitors and they were filled with sedition. So two very, very nasty charges against these people. So I can understand that some people, especially those in business, didn't want to lose their custom and perhaps tried to keep it quiet.
That was really interesting, John. I liked the way you visited some graves that we don't, include often in other tours, if at all. So just what you mentioned about the newspapers, were there any publications that supported annexation?
Yes, there were. There was a man by the name of, I think his name was Mcneil. He did not stay around, but he was the editor of a newspaper out of Nanaimo. And yes, there were newspaper editors who supported annexation. They just didn't last very long. So it would be interesting to actually read a little bit more from their columns. They're not easily available, especially during the pandemic. We can get a lot of newspapers online through newspapers.com or the BritishColonist.com and the Times and so on. But the annexationist newspapers, which had a short lifespan, I couldn't find.
Yeah. Well, anyway, thank you again. That was really great.
You're most welcome. Glad you liked it. And if there aren't any other comments or questions, I'm glad you had a chance to join me today. And next weekend, it's going to be May Q. Wong, the author of Victoria in Color. And it will be our last tour on Zoom before we resume in-person tours on June the 20th. And May is going to be talking about the great diversity of people who were in Victoria, and many of them who were first in their field in a number of different areas. So if you have a chance, please join us for that one. And otherwise, maybe in a couple of weeks, on a sunny day, or even a rainy day, we'll see you here at Ross Bay Cemetery or some of the other cemeteries as well. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John, for a wonderful tour.